A Passage to India, novel by E. M. Forster, published in 1924 and considered one of the author's finest works. The novel examines racism and colonialism as well as a theme Forster developed in many earlier works, namely, the need to maintain both ties to the earth and a cerebral life of the imagination. The book portrays the relationship between the British and the Indians in India and the tensions that arise when a visiting Englishwoman, Adela Quested, accuses a well-respected Indian man, Dr. Aziz, of having attacked her during an outing. Aziz has many defenders, including the compassionate Cecil Fielding, the principal of the local college. During the trial, Adela hesitates on the witness stand and then withdraws the charges. Aziz and Fielding go their separate ways, but 2 years later they have a tentative reunion. As they ride through the jungles, an outcrop of rocks forces them to separate paths, symbolizing the racial politics that caused a breach in their friendship. A Passage to India begins in Chandrapur, a city in India. 2 English women are visiting, Adela Quested and Mrs. Moore. They are there to see Ronnie Heaslop, a magistrate in Chandrapur. Ronnie is Adela's fiancé and Mrs. Moore's son. The 2 women dream of experiencing the real India during their journey. Forster also introduces readers to Aziz, a Muslim Indian doctor. He is having dinner with his friends and complaining about the treatment Indians receive from the English community in India. The men speculate over whether an Englishman and Indian can ever be friends. Later that evening, Aziz encounters Mrs. Moore in a mosque. The 2 speak, and Mrs. Moore treats Aziz kindly. He is taken aback that an Englishwoman could be so kind to him. The English community in Chandrapur host a party to help Adela and Mrs. Moore become more acquainted with the area and its people. The event is quite awkward, with the Indians and English rarely mixing. Adela does meet Cecil Fielding at the party. He is the English principal of a local college and is very much in favor of mixing with the Indian population of Chandrapur. Fielding organizes a dinner to which he invites Adela, Mrs. Moore, and Aziz. A Hindu professor named Godbole is also in attendance. Fielding's dinner goes much more smoothly than the previous party. Aziz and Fielding get along very well and quickly form a close bond. The dinner is soured by the arrival of Ronnie, who acts arrogantly. This behavior almost pushes Adela to break off her engagement with him. Aziz organizes an expedition to the Marabar caves. Adela, Mrs. Moore, Fielding, and Godbole are all invited. Fielding and Godbole miss their train and are late as a result. Aziz, Adela, and Mrs. Moore begin to explore the caves by themselves. The caves unsettle Mrs. Moore, and she becomes unwell. She decides to remain where she is as the others continue to explore. Adela and Aziz have a moment of privacy in which Adela asks Aziz if he has multiple wives. This is because she is reconsidering her relationship with Ronnie. Aziz takes great offense to this and sees it as representative of her prejudices about India. He is a widower. Aziz then leaves in anger. He eventually returns to find Adela gone. At the bottom of the caves, he finds Fielding, who informs him that Adela left abruptly. Not long after, Aziz is arrested on a charge of rape that Adela has made against him. This turns the entire English community in Chandrapur against Aziz. Only Fielding and Mrs. Moore believe in his innocence. Before Aziz's trial, Ronnie pushes Mrs. Moore to return to England. She does so but passes away during the journey. The trial commences. During it, Adela is questioned under oath about what transpired between her and Aziz in the caves. She goes back on her accusation and declares Aziz innocent. The case falls apart and Aziz is free. Following the trial, Adela stays with Fielding at the local college, as the English community has shunned her. Fielding warms to her because she was brave enough to declare Aziz innocent. Ronnie then breaks off his engagement with Adela. Both Adela and Fielding return to England separately. Aziz is upset that Fielding, a man he considered a close friend, has become so close to the woman who almost falsely imprisoned him. He declares that he will no longer interact with the English. The final section of A Passage to India takes place 2 years later. Aziz is now a chief doctor in a Hindu region far from Chandrapur. One day, he discovers that Fielding and his brother-in-law, Ralph Moore, are in the area. Aziz is deeply upset by Fielding's presence as he believes Fielding to have married Adela. He later discovers that Fielding really married Stella Moore, Mrs. Moore's daughter from her second marriage. At the end of Forster's novel, Aziz and Fielding reconcile. They take a ride on a rowboat together before Fielding returns to England. The two men conclude that they can be friends, but not yet. It will only be fully possible once India and England's colonial relationship significantly alters. A Passage to India is a critique of British rule of India. The British are not shown as tyrants, although they do fail to understand Indian religion and culture. They are also convinced that the British Empire is a civilizing force on the benighted natives of India, and they regard all Indians as their inferiors, incapable of leadership. And yet, in their own way, the English try to rule in a just way. Ronnie, for example, the city magistrate, is completely sincere when he says that the British are out here to do justice and keep the peace. And there is no trace of satire in the passage that shortly follows this, which describes Ronnie's daily routine. Every day he worked hard in the court trying to decide which of two untrue accounts was the less untrue, trying to dispense justice fearlessly, to protect the weak against the less weak. The incoherent against the plausible, surrounded by lies and flattery. Ronnie is also aware of the hostility between Hindus and Muslims, and believes that a British presence is necessary to prevent bloodshed. Even Fielding, the most sympathetic of the English characters, does not argue that the British should leave India. However, the British lack any ability to question their own basic assumptions about race and empire, and as such they become the objects of Forster's biting satire. The economic consequences of British imperialism are hinted at only briefly in the novel. This occurs when Fielding mentions to Godbull and Adela that mangoes can now be purchased in England. They ship them in ice-cold rooms. You can make India in England apparently, just as you can make England in India. This hints at the economic exploitation of India. The British claim to be in India for the good of the Indians, whereas in fact, they are there to increase their own wealth by setting up a system of trade that is entirely beneficial to themselves. The English, schooled in a fairly simple version of Christianity, are unable to understand the mysterious spirituality of India. Mrs. Moore shows some interest in the topic when she first arrives in the country. She likes the idea of resignation, being passively resigned to the will of God, which she associates with Indian thought. She is also attracted to the unity of everything in the universe, another idea she associates with India. But the incident in the caves, when she hears the echo, unnerves her. The echo annihilates all distinctions in the name of the unity of life, and also annihilates distinctions between good and evil. This is far from the Christian view of life, at least in Mrs. Moore's view, and leads her into despair and apathy. But this is merely a Westerner's point of view. Against the negative portrayal of Indian spirituality implicit in the echo incident is a more positive vision that occurs in Part 3 of the novel. There is no mistaking the joy and affirmative value of the Hindu festival conducted at Mao, in which the birth of Lord Krishna is enacted. Once again, this is rendered largely from the outsider's point of view, since neither Aziz nor Fielding understands it, but it well represents the mystery of Indian spirituality that cannot be penetrated by Westerners. The clash of cultures can be seen not only in Mrs. Moore's response to India but also in Fielding's. Fielding does not believe in God and therefore has no interest in the contrast between Eastern and Western spirituality, but nonetheless, as Chapter 32 shows, he feels far more at home with the forms of Western architecture he encounters in Venice than with the temples of India. The temples represent to him merely the muddle of India, whereas Western architecture presents him with a view of the harmony between the works of man and the earth that upholds them, the civilization that has escaped muddle, the spirit in a reasonable form, with flesh and blood subsisting. A Passage to India is a marvelously written, marvelously sad novel. The novel emotively and naturally recreates the Raj in India and offers insight into how the empire was run. Ultimately, though, it's a tale of powerlessness and alienation. Even friendship and the attempt to connect fails. A passage from E.M. Forster's To India fits the theme of realism because of the friendship between the Indians and the British, the clash of cultures between the Hindus and the Muslims, and the different religions of the two groups. The author E.M. Forster does a good job of showing how the Indians, British, and Muslims in India get along, how they live, and what they believe.